Hello, my name is Vince Marazita. I'd like to thank the organizers of Coverings for allowing me to share some ideas with you today. So without any further ado, here is Stone Trends 2020. Whenever I give a speech, I prefer, of course, to be there in person. Thanks again for joining me via computer, via virtual means. But I also like to just stimulate people's ideas about images, about times in history, about how stone has affected our history. And I wanted to start today just to recognize what we're all going through and staying at home and thinking about everything in our private lives, our businesses, that basically to look through history to see when construction had been hit hard like we're being hit hard right now. And I thought I'd pull up the example of the Duomo in Siena. It's an amazing place to go visit, but I was so surprised the very first time I went and to see that most of the cathedral had not been finished. In other words, they were going to double the finish, but the cathedral, but the bubonic plague hit the city, and the nave that they had spent 10 years building had to be abandoned because of losing so many people during the construction process. A more modern example of construction being hard hit by historical events was the financial panic in the early part of the 1900s. They were redesigning the facade of the Met, and as you can see here, I think that you can see my cursor, at the top of these columns, they had actually already prepared the limestone blocks that were then going to be sculpted into various figures on all above each one of the sets of columns. When the panic hit, construction halted, and when they started back up, they actually never finished it, and it still stands like that today. So let's look at stone. Let's look at history. Let's look at some images that I hope will get you to stimulate the creative juices in your designs and your conceptual use of stone and how you look at stone for the future. So first, let's go by what we see often in many of our cities, kind of the idea of modernity for the last few decades are buildings like this. And what do you see? What kind of building is this? Yes, it's a skyscraper. Yes, this is New York. Yes, this is glass. But what if I told you it takes 60% of limestone to create glass? Another 20% of sand and other materials, other minerals, put through huge kilns. So you do need stone to create these buildings. The cement alone, think of the sand that goes into the cement. If we ever had problems with the supply of sand, which we do in certain parts of the world, it would be very tough to build these kind of buildings. But aside from being tough, look at this headline. New York mayor takes aim at glass towers as energy hogs. De Blasio is calling for the new Stone Age because he recognized stone as being a green material, not energy hogs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But in the same vein, the new Stone Age, before this virus hit, I was planning on going to London in March to go see this exhibit on my way to a factory assessment. The Building Center in London is sponsoring this from February through September. I hope they'll reopen it after the London reopens as well. But the new Stone Age is the title of this exhibit. It's very interesting because it says it's celebrating the potential and beauty of structural stone. Structural stone, which I believe we've all forgotten about. Structural stone, many architects don't study any longer in their architecture curriculum. However, if you ask anyone if they studied architectural history, they have studied architectural stone. So I think if any of you are, when travel starts up again, if any of you are in the London area, keep that in mind. So buongiorno, like I always do with architectural conferences that I sponsor, I try to get out into quarries. I'm going to start this presentation with this quarry, which is probably my favorite quarry visit ever, because it's the oldest quarry I've ever been in. Any guesses of where it is? I guess here's a hint. You can see this beginning of a pyramid type structure on the left. Yes, this is where blocks were extracted to build the pyramids in Giza. A little bit about me. Yes, I am kind of a wannabe architect. I had started architectural school, went over to Italy to learn more about buildings. I taught at the architectural department in Genoa while I was there on a Rotary scholarship. And then I came back hired by the Italian government to actually work on stone promotions, and that got me started in the stone industry specifically. I am a stone consultant. I specialize in selection, sourcing, and testing of stone for architecture, and I'm working on a few pretty interesting projects right now. So if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to talk with you about any of your projects as well. Today, what we're going to look at are a few things. First of all, I think to be able to understand the stone business, you need to understand the sourcing channels. And as you look into selecting and testing stones, you need to have a good list of criteria to do so. So I'm going to try to go over that as well. And as we're talking about those criteria, we want to get an idea of how stone is actually being used in interiors and exteriors. And then finally, we'll look at some general trends that I see throughout the year in the recent years, let's say. So I like to start with this cowboy philosopher, Will Rogers, who is very famous for the expression, "I never met a man I didn't like." I have Vince's corollary on this, is I never met a stone I didn't like. This basically points out that there are no bad stones. It's just bad applications, possibly. So I think there are incredible stones on the market today, a lot of stones that we've never seen used in architecture. Because of quarrying equipment today, we're able to go to all corners of the earth to extract materials and bring them to market. So that puts the onus on us to do a lot more research on how that stone is going to be used. And actually, how has stone been used? I like to look at examples in North America. This is in the Tabasco area of Mexico. These Olmec heads, these famous 7 to 10 ton heads that were sculpted to immortalize the emperors of the time. Again, we still don't know how they sculpted these heads because they're made out of basalt, but an amazing tribute to immortality through the use of stone. Going a little bit north of the states, this is in the area of Labrador. Most all over, the Inuit Indians use this labradorite, most of us know it as a very expensive stone, as landmarkers to make these inuksuks that we believe are landmarks. But they're such an important graphic element that even the nation of Canada used it as their symbol in the Vancouver Olympics in 2010. Of course, whether the symbol is a statue or a point of reference, stone can be cultural representations. As we know from Stonehenge, if you showed just the silhouette of Stonehenge to anyone in the world, most people know where that's located. We still don't know how those boulders got to where they are. There are plenty of guesses and theories, but to carry such heavy stones over the bog for so many hundreds of miles was amazing. East Item Totem, in the same way. We think that there were wooden sledges, but there is very little wood left on the island. Again, an amazing historical heritage for the use of stone. Just like the Aswan obelisk. If you go into Egypt, you'll see this amazing, I still haven't been here, but I'm looking forward to it. It's the unfinished obelisk, it's called. Basically is there because it cracked. They had finished quarrying it, were about to split it and stand it up, and they noticed that there was a crack, so they moved on to another area of the quarry. This is one of the few ways that we know how they quarried back in ancient Egypt. Of course, during my travels, either to open quarries or to look into geological deposits, I try to visit as many archaeological sites as I can. This was a particular trip to Guatemala, and you can see how the Mayas in the area commemorize their emperors as well with these styles that you'll find throughout cultures. But I thought it was fun. It was just an appropriate dinner. Our food was actually prepared on a pestle in basalt. And as part of the tortillas, they actually use a little bit of cow or lime in the tortilla. So here I was eating food that was actually prepared on stone as well, with minerals of stone inside. So I thought, just think of the stories that stone brings to your travels and the monuments that you visit that are in stone. Of course, stone uses and symbols. Stone, because of this particular museum, if any of you have been to the British Museum in London, this particular stone, called the Rosetta Stone, helped us translate hieroglyphics. This is really because of this stone we know about Egyptian culture. Without that stone, we probably wouldn't. This is another example called the Palermo Stone. It's considered the first history book written in stone as well. It's basically the genealogy of the various emperors. But have a look at this. This is Quarrying Stone. Again, while we're looking at trends, think of the trends, the industrial trends as well. This is a quarry that's not even 100 years old. You can still find places on Earth that are still quarrying in this particular fashion. Of course, moving stone is a very big part of how we do things in stone. This is a group. You can see the hemp ropes, the wooden sledges that they're using to get this big stone down the hill. This, whether it's a primitive culture or advanced cultures, we still have to decide how to get the blocks down, how big the blocks are, where they can fit, how we transport them. So that limits our use of stone as well. Now, many of us in the architectural industries get to a point in the project called VE, or value engineering. None of us seem to like it because in certain cases stone is value engineered out. But I like to say instead, let's add value. Let's recognize the value of stone. So instead of VE, let's call it AVE, added value engineering. So added value I see in three different categories that stone can help any project, any story of a project, any story of a concept. And those three areas are aesthetics, performance, and heritage. Now, designers, marketers, salesmen in the stone industry should all be familiar with all of these vocabulary terms and be able to speak about color, cut, the finish, the geology of the stone as you're discussing aesthetics. Not just blue, but talk about all of those things, the grain of the stone. When we're talking about performance, I purposely chose this building. We'll talk more about this arena in Verona. But with performance, the vocabulary words that we all need to be a good understanding of all of these terms and how stone applies is basically when you're talking about high performance buildings, when we're looking at those glass towers in New York, when we're looking at how stone can be our friend from a green point of view, all of these vocabulary terms come to mind. And then, of course, heritage. There are very few building materials that have a history, that have uses that can be pulled up through history. And if you really think about it, the monuments of humanity, the monuments that are recognized by the World Heritage Sites, all tend to be made of stone or have some sort of stone elements in them. So the importance of that heritage, I think, is very important as we're doing research into the use of various types of stone. But what is our job? What is our job in the stone industry? Many of us are style interpreters. We have to talk to our clients and understand what they mean when they say modern, what they mean when they say, I want a natural style. Of course, we have to be spatial artists, and this isn't just the designers and the interior decorators that we're talking with. It's architects, it's engineers, it's people who are cutting the stone, the fabricators. But we need to be able to communicate on all levels of these arguments here. I like to say material mixologist because although we like to think only in stone, we all know that on projects we don't have projects that have 100% stone. So knowing how stone works with other materials is fundamental. Of course, marketing and sales professionals, if you really think about it, anyone listening to this speech is really a marketing and sales professional. Whether you're a designer or an engineer doing cut tickets, you really are there to help a client understand what the choice is being made, why that material has the value it does, and possibly also to create those stories you want to use when you're talking about the building. Now, who's actually on our team? Because it takes a team in any type of construction. Who is on our team? I consider the material suppliers, the design professionals, and I like to underline this one. That's why I put it in quotation marks. Thinking craftsmen. Thinking craftsmen are worth their weight in granite, really. It's unbelievable how important someone who's had experience with stone is to the overall construction process. Of course, skilled installers, you're always going to look for people who know how to install stone, and then educated stakeholders on all levels are very important for the success of a project. What is our common goal? Now, you won't see this goal too often, but I do have a client right now that lets us work within the framework of a 100-year life cycle. So I think if we could think about this as a goal, creating timeless, high-performance buildings that have a successful life cycle of 100 years or more, buildings that connect our past with our future. I think this is a good way to begin this speech, set our mindsets on maybe making better buildings than what we've done before, higher performing buildings, but buildings that will also last. And then we'll really see the true value of stone as a construction material. So let's look at the possible sources and formats of dimension stone. First of all, I always like to ask people to name a few building materials that come from quarries. Just stop and think for a second. If you can think of some building materials that come from quarries, write them down, give yourself a test. Okay, let's ask that maybe in another way. Name building materials that don't come from quarries. Have a look at this list. And really, one of the few that's not on there is wood. Wood grows, if you say it grows out of the ground, so it has a connection with the earth, but almost everything that we use in the building environment, in the built environment, comes from quarries, comes from a hole in the ground. So it's how we deal with those holes. It's how our industry and other construction industries approach those quarries, those mines, is how our interaction with nature is and how we'll be measured in the future too. So let's talk about those quarries. What we call quarries are those holes in the ground for the dimension stone. There are three types: open air, gallery, and pit. Open air are similar to what we saw in Egypt. It's when you would see an outcrop of a stone and you basically quarry from the top down. You take off the organic material and quarry the stone that you can see. A gallery or tunnel are like these cathedrals that you'll find in Carrara, Italy, which were basically created with the modern technology. There are examples of older galleries and tunnels, but these ones, as you can tell by the walls of this tunnel, were created with in the years of diamond saws and diamond wire. There are places like Ardesia in Liguria. It's a slate in the tunnel quarries of Liguria that this particular region of Italy does not allow for open air quarries because it's a big touristic area, so they don't want an open air or open pit quarry, so they are forced to tunnel into the mountain to get the slate. Pit quarries, this is probably the least used anymore, but they can be a very deep pit that you actually lift the block out of the quarry, as you can see here, on one of these derrick cranes, gantry cranes, derrick cranes, excuse me, daddy long leg cranes we call them. But in general, in pit quarries, you don't see roads to go down. Open air quarries, we develop roads that trucks can go down, pick up the blocks, and bring them back out. What are we looking for from a quarry? We're looking for commercial sized blocks. Look at this photo. All the blocks are different. You might see edges are finished differently. Once you understand more about quarrying, you'll understand what these ridges are as well. But in general, we're looking for commercial sized blocks. The main product, like I say, is this block. This is when I went out on a block inspection for a project that we're doing in New York right now. To give you an idea that they're not always a regular prism and a regular rectangle. Often you'll find they come out of the quarry as they come out along natural fissures or along cuts. But where are quarries? Really anywhere. Let's say this is Yosemite. That tonalite or granite that you see is in Half Dome and is one of the best compressive strength granites that exist on the earth. Of course, we can't quarry in our national parks, but they're there. Here's a very interesting quarry that they used to get the blocks for the pyramids as well. This was actually recreated into a cathedral underground, and this is it just in the outskirts of Cairo. Here's another quarry that once it was quarried out, rather than reclaiming the land, the families all believed in this city that it was such an important part of their past. This quarry gave life, gave food and water to their families throughout history, so they decided to make a very public civic structure, this soccer stadium in Braga, Portugal. So let's talk a little bit about international supply. You've heard me giving stone examples from different countries around the world, and it really has been an international industry for a long time. And so we have stone from virtually every continent. Where there's water and stone, you're able to move the stone, and you'll find that many of the ancient peoples moved water and stone throughout their empires as well. So how big really is the U.S. market? We know that there are large producers in the United States. We do produce probably about 25 to 30% of the stone that's consumed in the U.S. But how big is our market? When you're looking at the size, let's talk about those trends. Now, when I entered this industry back in the 80s, there were only about $500 million worth of stone being used in the United States. That was 1986 about. Now we're at 2.8 billion. We're down a little bit in 2019 compared to before because of just economic downturn in construction a little bit, but also we have a little bit of a trade war going on between the U.S. and China as well. So there was a little bit of a downturn, but we're still using more stone than we ever have before. This is a period of a lot of stone growth. As all of us know, there are different distribution channels to access that stone. There are some quarriers that sell to block traders. There's the slab market, which we would consider a semi-finished product, a slab. The slab market is really what the U.S. stone industry, especially the residential industry, is based on that slab market. Then we have tiles that go from the quarrier to the processor to the importer to the retailer. And some go directly from the quarrier to the big box stores. So there are different distribution channels. And of course, cut to size, we'll talk a little bit more about the main cut to size areas in the world. But in general, there are different distribution channels that are used throughout the world too. Now, natural stone market, the harmonized tariffs codes, when I give you these statistics, if you wanted to follow them on your own, you would go to the harmonized tariff schedule. If you're importing anything, it's one of 92, 93 different chapters. The first two digits that you see here, 25 would be chapter 25, 6802 would be chapter 68. And most of the stone that's imported into the United States comes under this worked monumental building stone right here. So if you look at that alone, that's probably would account for about 85 to 90% of the stone that's coming into the United States. So that's what I choose to look at. So let's talk about the top countries that are supplying. Think just for a second who you think are the top suppliers of stone to the United States. Of course, we're not counting the U.S. quarriers themselves, but these are the imported materials that come into the States. Okay, well, there you go. So Brazil, China, and Italy are always in the top three. India and Turkey are always in the fourth and fifth position. When I say always, since I've been working in the stone industry, Well, let's not put it that far back, because China really wasn't there back in the 80s or the 90s. China came on pretty strong in the middle 90s and then worked its way up into the top three. China was in the number one position last year, but Brazil overtook China. China had quite a downturn this year because of those new tariffs that went on. So now China and Italy are very close in terms of market share. Brazil, being the number one slab producers, let's say, of materials, especially to get into our residential market. Brazil is still holding number one strong. China and Italy are probably considered the two cut to size markets, let's say, where a lot of fabrication for commercial projects are being done. India, mainly granite we're talking about there, and Turkey, mainly travertine and calcareous stones, and that 10% of their market. But if you look, these five countries make up 83% of the total stone imported into the United States. Now, as we talk about stone, there is something called the name game I'm going to mention a little bit later, but it's really important, I think, to be very transparent and try to think closer to geology than to commerce when we're classifying stones. So it's important that we all remember those three basic categories: sedimentary, metamorphic, and igneous, and how they apply to building stones. So building stones in the sedimentary category would be considered, you've heard, limestone, travertine, sandstone. Limestone and travertine are basically similar chemical contents, a lot of calcareous content. If you see fossils, they're in one of these three categories. Fossils usually say sedimentary stone. I don't think I've ever met an exception to that rule, but I'm sure there is, because in geology there are exceptions. But in general, if you see fossils in a stone, it's going to be a sedimentary stone. Metamorphic, these are the metamorphic stones to consider when you're thinking about building stones. So marble, slate, quartzite, and gneiss. Now, there are some gneisses that kind of straddle the categories between metamorphic and igneous, but marble, slate, and quartzite are the names that you'll hear about geology. We'll talk a little bit more how they're used in commerce in just a bit. And then igneous, of course, are granites, basalts, porphyry, gabbros, and diorites. And don't worry if you've never heard of this category, gabbros and diorites, in the past, but that's where a lot of our grays and black granites, what we call granites, are actually gabbros or diorites. But in general, those are igneous. Igneous, when you think of something igneous, think of more molten, liquid lava that turns into rock, liquid molten mass that turns into rock, cooled either underground or above the ground and becomes granite. Now, when I say the name game, just to give one example, the categories, those geological categories, it's accepted in commerce in the United States to call anything that holds a high polish a marble. So there are many limestones on the industry that are known as marbles, just because they can hold that high polish. They are hard limestones, but they are limestones. So the name game, we call it a marble. People, even salespeople, will call it a marble. But especially when you get into structural use of stone, the exterior use of stones, large commercial projects where you have to do testing, you'll need to use the proper petrographic category. So when is it important? It is important in those categories, especially when you're looking to decide whether or not a stone is appropriate or fit for use for exterior purposes. Talk about testing. We should all keep an eye on testing. Of course, we have the Natural Stone Institute that has its own laboratory here. They do the ASTM standards, American Society of Testing Materials, and those are mainly the standards that we're using. The CE, of course, looks for their CE marking on stones. As of October 2013, they've had to put stones through the process of being registered, and they have to have what's like a material data sheet on every stone that comes out of quarries before it's allowed to be used on buildings, for example, in the UK. Not all over Europe, but in general, that is the trend. Technical trends then, if you wanted to find Europe, if you work on projects in Europe, this is the committee that works on those trends in Europe. Like I said, the ASTM, it's C18 is the committee that works on dimension stone. Now, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the United States, there's two different types of material specifications. One is for the materials themselves. So, for example, ASTM C503 is for the category of marble. It will tell you the various testing and the ranges of the testing if you look in the Dimension Stone manual, what sort of test results should be appropriate so that it proves that that stone may be fit for purpose. So this is just testing the materials themselves for use of interiors, exteriors. And then there are the physical mechanical tests. Again, many of these are used for specific projects. You should always talk with your stone consultant and your stone supplier about which tests should be covered for any given project as well. In particular, this is the CE marking. You might ask for a copy of this one. It basically regulates the names that are used that we haven't had that type of regulation in the past. So people can't create commercial names for a traditional stone, for example. This is very helpful in understanding where a stone comes from, how a stone has been used in the past, even before you start considering it for use on your project. Within the U.S., one of the newest standards, we've worked with the ANSI, another testing association, to create a standard. This one helps to look at best practices under quarrying and processing, first processing. And again, it's our sustainability standard that we're looking for here. Sorry about the phone in the background. But the sustainability standard will show which quarries are taking testing seriously and which are looking to be a very sustainable process in their factory. Now, when we talk about trends in fabrication, one of the ones I like the best is finishing. We'll talk a little bit about finishing, but keeping in track of what's being done with fabrication can happen in a number of places. It can be in the factory if you go see the factory itself. You can read in many of the magazines. Stone World is one of the best worldwide magazines to keep track of fabrication trends. I like to talk about trade shows, visiting trade shows. We should be at Coverings. Coverings has a whole section just on machinery. So even if you don't import machinery, I suggest going to that section of the trade show to see what's new, to see what's possible. Verona is also another great area to see where a new machinery, just like Xiamen in China as well. But watch the websites of machinery suppliers. You'll see the new types of things that can be done. But in general, during my professional career, some of the biggest developments in machinery, technology, blades, abrasive has been in the diamond wire technology. That has revolutionized our whole industry. Just as water jet cutting, water jet finishing is also starting to change a lot of ways we do things. So I would keep in mind the two W's, water and wire, in how we're using them in fabrication. It's just an example of a wire saw from a few years back when they first came out. And then, of course, in trends, green certifications, green testing. A big proponent of the green movement here in construction is LEED, of course. Whether you're an architect or a designer or a salesman, you can get LEED certification, so you understand the various arguments that have to do with construction and how construction can become more sustainable. If you want to look at the stone interpretation of the green movement, let's say, go to the website of the Natural Stone Council, www.genuinestone.com, and they'll walk you through that as well. But like I say, the green building ratings are really changing how we look at buildings. They're really pushing us towards better performing buildings, buildings that don't become energy hogs, buildings that also use materials that respect the environment, that don't take kilns to create. We're in a situation where stone really could be creating a new stone age through the use of all sorts of new technology that haven't been tried before with the use of stone. Some people venture to say that stone may even start replacing cement in structural use. That's that exhibit that I told you about in London. So let's look and see how stone plays into the performance category as well. And you start adding a lot more value to the use of stone, for example, in facades. Now, design criteria. This is a trend that changes, but in a lot of ways remains the same. You really, to have successful projects, I think there are two things you need to do. You need to get the right team, and you need to choose the right material. For those of you who have seen my speech before, choosing the right material, I use an example that is kind of makes me sad this year, because 2020 has been a difficult year, losing important people. But I always like to say both of these guys played basketball, both played for over 20 years, and both spoke Italian fluently. Of course, we lost Kobe this year in 2020, but when you're looking at someone who's been doing something for 20 years, you want to say, how have you been doing it? Have you been doing it well? Have you been, what have you done? What marks your 20 years of experience? So as you're selecting someone for your team, these are different criteria that I like to use when I'm interviewing new fabricators for a job. I like to walk the whole design, all of the stakeholders through this. And especially now, we have to start thinking about doing this online, doing this with Zoom. Let's say that we're going to have to shelter in place for a number of months, or this may happen again where we have to depend on the tools that we have. So being able to do this type of selection while you're at home is very important. Usually this week at Coverings, I'm doing this kind of selection on the show floor. So I'm going to be taking advantage of those meeting planners that are on the Coverings website to actually go through some of these things and do virtual tours with some of the exhibitors that were scheduled to be at Coverings. Now, choosing the right material, that is not always easy to do with photos. I don't want to say if you can avoid it, especially for large commercial projects and large amounts of stone on one project. You really need to get the quarry inspected, the stones inspected, the fabricators inspected. But, photos and videos can go a long way. So as you're looking at stones, these are various things that I always say that should go into every discussion when you're talking with your stone supplier. Some of you have heard me talk about this list in the past, and of course my number one criteria is kind of hidden in the list. What do you think is my number one criteria for choosing a stone? Have a look. Some people say cost. Cost is very important, of course. Some people say aesthetics. If I'm looking for a brecciated red-colored stone, that's what I'm looking for, yes. But what my number one is this. Just like location for real estate, I believe availability is everything when it comes to stone selection. Because if they don't have the stone that you need, and if you can't get it to site when you need it, you need to choose a different stone. So the other selection criteria we've added, a little bit when in my discussion about adding value, ask your stone supplier, how has it been used in the past? They may have historical monuments that actually add to the story of your design as well. So knowing the traditional use, especially if it's been used in the same city and weather patterns that you're planning on to build the new building. And then, of course, this is going to be in our as we're reopening society, this is going to be very important with regards to the health because of all of the layoffs during the coronavirus. We're going to have to see how our industry meets the challenge of reopening as well. So I think we're going to all have to look at that financial health of the supplier pretty much with under the microscope in the next year and a half or so. So when I'm talking about name and location, these are different things to look into. When I'm talking about aesthetic characteristics, you should be able to describe all of these things in an email without even having a photo. So practicing even without the name of the stone is a good thing to work on. When I'm talking about availability, I'm not talking just about that finished product. I'm talking about the quality of stone I want. Almost all stones are quarried in different qualities. The quantity, if I need, 50 blocks for a 25,000 square foot facade, I need to be sure that they will have those 50 when I need those blocks. The block size is paramount. Supply times, of course, again, for availability. Then again, a good question when you're selecting stones again is what finishes are available in this stone? What finishes can I do on this stone? Not all stones can have a flame finish. Not all stones can be polished. So a fair question to your stone supplier is that. This was just a 10 by 10 booth at one of the trade shows, I thought, in the beginning years of when I started watching about finishing and how innovative finishing can be. These are 2 stones finished differently, 16 different finishes on each stone. It's just amazing the variety you can get visually, aesthetically, just in the types of finishes that are available on the market today. Pattern becomes very important, especially on large surfaces, horizontal surfaces, vertical surfaces. Look at blend, and in this call out down here, read this to yourselves. So unless you specify it in your specifications, you will get a blended pattern, and you leave the blend up to the installer. If that's not what you want, if you want a side slip, you want an end slip, if you want a different type of pattern, you need to specify that in your documents. This is just an example of a dry lay. I like to point out the example of the architect who's standing here. She took one of my architectural conferences. It just got out of architectural school and was given the work of the stone selection for a very large project bank in London. I think in general, when someone has to deal with this, they should always make sure that they're working with a dry layout. There is a cost to this, but you can certainly save money in case you run into the problems. Quanto costa, of course, there you can talk about cost criteria in many ways. So learning objectives, identify marketing trends. Marketing and just communications over the next 10 years are going to be using all these tools that we're using as we're sheltering in place. More and more we'll be doing on our cell phones. So you need to position yourselves to be able to do so if you're someone who sells or in the distribution channel of stone. I think one of the best investments anyone can make right now is in really high quality photos, what I would call forensic quality photos. So important in your conversations, especially if we have to do them over Zoom or other types of carriers. But at this point, while we are sheltering in place, we want to gather as much information as we can about stones, about suppliers that you want to use, that you want to work with. So let's have a look at some of these trends. The green trends. Here's Vegas, an example of a quarry that was basically open for the city center project, one of the largest projects in recent years worldwide, let's say, in Las Vegas. This rainbow quartzite was opened from an agglomerate quarry very successfully. This is a single building, 1,000 containers of Roman travertine now sitting on a mountain in Los Angeles. So when you come out to visit me in Los Angeles, I'll be happy to take you here. This is a Spanish granite, was the best match for an extension of the original granite that was used on the Utah State Capitol. What I like to show in this particular one is the complexity of the panels that can be basically created and then lifted into place that's being used in many designs nowadays. Just as column wraps rather than solid columns are kind of what are authorized by building departments here. We have the Marriott Desert Ridge Resort. This is an example of a completely adhered facade using the stone inside and out. So this is an example. It's a trend that we see more and more, especially in areas where you need to number for the local tradesmen that might not be used to setting stone. But this was an example of a project that was totally numbered in Italy, sent over and successfully installed in Arizona. You can see the patterns. And then, of course, as concept, people get concept from all over. This is the sketch for a cathedral in southern Italy by Renzo Piano, talking about structural stone with reinforced cables for seismic control. These arches are 50 meters in span. It's an incredible project down in southern Italy. Just like this was designed, this sketch was made before in the early 80s. In 1985 it was presented. In 85 to 87, when I was first in the stone, I was walking around seeing mock-ups for this building, again using the new diamond wire. Because of budget, and it wasn't budget for the stone, it was budget for the substructure, that it was they chose to do it in steel instead of stone. But I always like to have people look at this thinking this could have been done in 1985 in stone. It still was a very large stone project. There's another stone tower on the other side in the flooring and the towers. And then getting back to the green solutions, just as an example of making the right choice of the right stone. This was a building that happened to be clad 3 times. They actually won the award for this third cladding in Mount Airy white granite. You can see where it's located. It's an extreme harsh environment. They didn't consider the stone the first time because they said it was too expensive. But recladding a building is much more expensive had they thought about cladding it with stone in the first place. It was so successful that they actually used this in the FDR Memorial Park on Roosevelt Island in New York as well. Again, quarries becoming part of our architecture. Interior uses of stone, if we're walking through the website, if we're going to have to walk through the website this year at Coverings, you'll see different types of products, from extremely thin slates to all sorts of back netted products to make for ease of installation. Illumination, back illumination is important, mosaics, all sorts of tiles, even machines that go hand in hand with applications for how to use end cuts and other pieces. Then, of course, sculptural stone lighting, stone that gives the character to the building. Here the sunlight comes in through the walls. These are only 1-inch alabaster panels, so that when it's lit up from nighttime, it glows on the outside. During the day, the sun comes through and lights it up, as you see here. Just as many photos can be used in trade shows, so can stone be clad with glass, basically glazed together with glass, getting very thin effects. Even if it is a granite-like material, it doesn't have to be an alabaster. So we have so many technologies to make these incredible spaces with stone, but remembering translucency, remembering three-dimensionality of stone is something to keep in mind as we're looking at projects and sourcing stone. Of course, keep in mind those finishes. It's just amazing that's all out of the same stone. The wonderful thing about the stories we create through our designs, this is just one of the trade show in Verona is an amazing show for design. I love to see the types of sculptural pieces that you find there, and the different types of things that can be made by the craftsmen that exist in the world today. Anything from objects to chaise lounge to bathrooms to backlit elements. You can get a lot of inspiration just by walking the show, like at Coverings too. And then there are buildings that are going to become, I think, just representative of how the architects can work with CAD. And this took 14 years to build, but they work with very complex shapes that have never been worked with before, and how stone can be a big partner in that new development as well. Using complex shapes and lighting and designing with this intention as a beacon up at the top of a hill. So in summary, we've tried to cover a lot in this introductory sort of presentation on stone trends. We've reviewed those geological classifications. You now know the 5 top supplying countries with the U.S. for our market here. We looked at some of the selection criteria, the ways that we use it both on interior and exterior as well. So whether it's immortalizing our emperors or showing pieces that represent our culture throughout the ages, I think stone can be a partner, both as we're living the stone and as we leave representations of what we want our society to be remembered for. I leave you with what I think is one of the most sustainable buildings in the world. It was built for entertainment over 2,000 years ago. It's still used for entertainment, and this is the arena in Verona. So the basic thought process today is to choose the right stone for the right job. That's the thought I'd like to leave you with, and please remember it the next time you're developing concepts, the next time you're talking about any type of stone, whether it's a kitchen countertop or a skyscraper in stone. Please involve the stakeholders during those initial discussions. So that's everyone from those thinking craftsmen we talked about to design professionals, general contractors, owners and developers, so that we can embrace our stone heritage and choose the right stone for the right job. So thank you for your time today. At this particular moment in world history, I hope it can come together as a global industry that we are. We need to work together to reopen our industry and be each other's rock, each other's foundation as we redefine our new path forward. Grazie and arrivederci. Choose the right stone. Feel free to email me for any information about this content, vmarazita@gmail.com. And I hope to see you at the next Coverings Conference. Take care.